Hello, Renegade marketers. Welcome to Renegade Marketers Unite, the top-rated podcast for B2B CMOs and other marketing-obsessed individuals. You're about to listen to a bonus huddle. What's a bonus huddle? Well, it's something that we do for the huddlers of CMO huddles based on topics that they think are really important. And it's a Q&A where I'm interviewing an expert. In this case, the expert is Ross Graber, Vice President and Principal Analyst over at Forrester. And we talked about building a predictive marketing model, something that all marketers really need to be doing as soon as possible. It's an exciting episode, so let's get to it. Hello, and welcome to our very special bonus huddle on metrics and models. And what we're looking here today is, what are the magic metrics? How many do you need? And how CMOs can get closer to the holy grail of attribution modeling and calculating ROI. We all know that this is a huge issue. It's an issue upwards with our boards and our CEOs. It's an issue with investors. And really, to get at this, our very special guest today is Ross Graber, Vice President and Principal Analyst serving B2B marketing and marketing operation leaders for Forrester. Ross joined Forrester through the acquisition of SiriusDecision, and now has spent over a decade as an analyst between the two. Now, prior to joining SiriusDecision, Ross spent 15 years as a marketing practitioner, including 3.5 years as director of marketing at Canoval and 7 years at Elsevier, good enough. Elsevier, I knew I had it right. Sorry, I'm becoming my father again. Today, we will be tapping into his deep expertise in marketing measurement, a topic that excites him almost as much as it does me. It really is exciting. Ross, welcome to this very special bonus huddle.
Thanks, Drew, and I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with today's reality and work our way to the ideal. So the big issues are marketers still struggle to show value. And I'm just wondering, I know this is something you've thought about a lot. What's going on here?
So let's start by reinforcing the point. Showing marketing's value is difficult. And our research tells us that it's been even more difficult in 2021 than it has been in the years leading up to it. Right now, showing and improving marketing ROI ranked as the top need that we heard in a quantitative study that we did among CMOs. And when I look at what's going on here, so I approach these things from a metrics angle. What are people measuring? How well is it working for them? Are they getting the story across? A couple of things stand out to me. First off is, if we want to understand if value measures are working, we've got to look at what organizations are measuring. And what I see is the most common place that B2B marketing orgs and marketing leaders turn when they're trying to express value is the question of, where is pipeline and where is revenue being sourced? Is marketing sourcing enough? When we study what's being measured by CMOs on their dashboards, the top two, the most used metrics on these dashboards are marketing sourced pipeline and marketing sourced revenue. And together, they appear on nearly half of all CMO dashboards.
Let me stop you there for a second. Why was this harder in 2021 than 20?
There are a lot of reasons that I can suggest. We've seen all of the pressure pent up around the pandemic. We've seen a tremendous increase in the amount of digital marketing that's being done. We're seeing a very big expectation when we're doing digital marketing and doing digital execution that there's going to be so much more clarity around how much value is being created. And sometimes that expectation isn't quite matching the reality of what we're measuring. So those are some of my best guesses.
Interesting. Okay, that is really, I mean, to me, that's fascinating, because I think you're exactly right. And we hear this in the huddles, that this expectation, oh, more digital, more measurement, but it really is just more data points. It's not necessarily the right data points, I guess, is what you're saying. And then we could sort of, that gets us to, it makes it probably easier to get to marketing sourced and revenue and marketing source pipeline. But what you're saying is those measures may not be the right measures.
Yeah, so here's what we know. the industry as a whole has been focused around sourcing for over a decade. And despite the sourcing focus, we're not doing all that much better or getting that much further in showing that marketing is contributing to the business. We're still struggling with, well, wait a second, is this really how value is being created? And I think a lot of that disconnect is being caused by changes in the ways that our buyers buy. Because as marketing leaders, so marketing leaders and marketers have been, in my experience, really smart about adapting to what their buyers need to help them make better purchasing decisions. We know, and give me a little bit of runway here on this one, because it's important to look at how buying is changing before we get back to why sourcing is not working. Some of the things we know, B2B buyers, they make decisions in groups. More now than ever before, with group buying taking place where most decisions are made in groups of 4 or more people. This idea of who sourced it or which of those 4 or 5 or 12 people came first, maybe not so important. But the other thing that we're seeing is buyers are putting a lot more energy into making the right decision. Our latest buying study showed us that on average, buyers are going through 27 different motions before they make a successful purchasing decision. And marketers know this, and we are trying to do our very best to support buyers across the entirety of that journey to help them arrive at the best decision. And hopefully that will be a decision to buy from us. But when you break that down and say, well, wait a second, buyers are doing all of these things, but as marketers, we're putting all of our focus when we report upward and when we report to sales and when we say what we're accomplishing, we're putting all of our focus on deciding if we found it or if somebody else found it. That's a disconnect. It's not working. And we've got to be able to change the way we view that to ensure that the way we measure is much more in tune with showing the value that's created when marketing gets involved in the way that it's intending to.
Part of this is that, and again, have so much empathy for the folks because it is a metric and it's not too hard to measure. And it feels good, right? That marketing was connected to this. Is it a metric that just needs to be going away because there are 27 different, as you said, motions? And so what if you were one of the motions when there are 26 others, right? Is basically your point. So do we just have to put marketing source and marketing influence completely aside?
The advice I've been giving lately is I'd like to see it deprioritized. When I start the story of how marketing is creating value in the business, I would much rather see that story be about the amount of revenue lift that's being created when marketing gets involved the way it's intending to, as opposed to leading that story with, hey, we found this much demand. It's a much more comprehensive way to think about not only what marketing is contributing, but what marketing's investment is going toward. Right now, so much of that other motion is completely not covered by the value story that's being told. We've got to develop better ways to tell a value story that matches the ways marketing is creating value for our buyers, our customers, our partners across the business.
So there's a couple of things that I'm thinking about. But before I get to that, so part of me wants to ask this question, and I know some CMOs that are listening, can we officially kill MQLs right now?
So at Forrester, for a number of years now, we have been advocating moving away from MQLs and toward understanding qualified opportunities. So we're looking to qualify groups of buyers instead of individuals. And when you really think about it, it's moving marketing to a mindset that sales, whether they spoke it in these words or not, has been operating on in B2B for years. This is really the alignment story. If as marketing, we are doing a better job highlighting when buying groups are in action, contemplating decisions, and bringing that to the attention of sales, but at the same time, we're bringing it to the attention of sales, but not stepping aside and say, hey, you take it from here. We need to be running this as a joint race to the finish line, because our buyers are going to turn to their sellers for some information, but they're going to turn back to the web, and they're going to turn back to marketing channels to acquire other pieces of information. And if we've just stepped away and said, well, wait a second, that's sales' problem now, we're not helping our buyers buy. We've got to make sure that we are aligning our efforts around the buyer and around the customer. And that's where good outcomes come from.
And so I'm imagining now, if there's these 27 different touches or motions, if you will, that the CMO is now thinking every step of the way, thinking about what role can marketing play at this moment, right? I mean, that's sort of what you're saying. So, and it's interesting, by the way, thank you for sharing. They found that when marketing is involved, the sales timeline is shortened by 25%. And I'm imagining what she's saying at that moment is that involved in more than just the, hey, here's the lead, but all the way through. And I wonder, does that stat sound good to you, Ross? Does that make sense? Is that what we're talking about here?
The timeline reduction?
Yeah.
So I've heard similar from other clients, but time is really a funny thing when it comes to opportunity life cycles. I have some clients who find that when marketing gets involved in a more substantial way, the time of the sale might go up, but so too might the success rate and the dollar value. So we're optimizing in some cases. If our objective is to optimize timeline, there's potential to do that. But I have other clients who are optimizing against deal size, solution complexity, success rate. So those are all pieces that we can manage with. The challenge is I've yet to see a great financial model that balances time and money. I do see really good models that balance interaction against deal size and success rate, but the time piece, that's been the trickiest one that I've watched.
So I asked this question, well, when is marketing not involved in pipeline or revenue creation? And I don't think it's true in all organizations, but certainly huddlers are lean to state of the art. But let's talk about that a little bit, because, you know, ultimately we're going to get to your model for what should be measured. But we're talking at this point in time, where does marketing and sales stop, and, you know, who's doing what here? Nice, easy question.
No, so I don't know that I'm going to give you a satisfying answer to where does marketing and sales stop, because really what I've seen is it doesn't even stop after the deal is closed and the solution is installed. It keeps going and going and going, because if we're doing really well, we are supporting new buyers into their customer life cycle, and from their customer life cycle into their next purchase and their next purchase after that. But I think maybe this is more a question of how do we start to summarize the value that marketing's creating as it's involved? That's a place where I certainly have a point of view. And that point of view really starts by showing that we understand that there's a level of marketing involvement that produces better deal outcomes. And the only way we're going to understand that is by starting to look. We've got to be able to look retroactively at opportunities that have been resolved, closed won, closed lost, and understand, at least for starters, the question of how much. How much has marketing been involved? And can I take those deals and start to segment them around, was marketing involved? Not at all, a little bit more, and a whole lot. And I'll come up with ranges of involvement. Is it 1 to 10 interactions, 10 to 20? It's going to vary based on your business. But what I'm looking to understand is if there is a sweet spot there, a level of interaction where we see that the deal sizes go up enough and the dollar values go up enough, that tells us, hey, wait a second, this is what we should be targeting our efforts toward. In this segment, we can feel good about our likely result when the number hits 12. And now that gives us the opportunity to say, when the number hits 12, we can calculate that historically we've seen a deal lift of 36% or 42%. There's a whole series of analysis that we do to assess that. But then I want to track my active pipeline and say how much of it is in that 12 interaction range, because it will allow me to understand that I'm doing the right things. It will allow me to see those opportunities that might not be behaving like winners, and I can either put more effort against them or decide to write them off. But I can also start to orient the way I apply resources and budget to driving that number of interactions. Because let's face it, for the most part, the thing that drives our program budgets is the amount of outreach that we're doing to individuals. It's not as much the sourcing driving the cost as it is understanding what those interactions are. Now I've got a much more solid way to think about what I've got to invest in my programs to make things happen.
Okay. I know you guys have studied how many metrics marketers are typically monitoring. Let's get that out of the way. And then let's start to get into some models that are, we're moving away from sourced and what we're moving to. So, but first, how many metrics are marketers typically monitoring?
So I'll start with what we asked. We asked respondents who were either the owners of their CMO dashboards or a frequent user of them, what metrics appear on those CMO dashboards. And what we saw is that on average, the number is 8. I don't want to make it like, hey, this eight is the magic number. It's not Sesame Street. 8 was the number that came in as, on average, that's what organizations are tracking. But what I saw is that that number also corresponded to the work that I do with my clients, where I will do CMO dashboard reviews with them. And the rationale behind it is, when we think about the amount of time that leaders typically have to go over the health of their business in a meeting setting, it seems to allow them to talk about 8 different elements of performance. So it felt about right. Now, what I've also seen is organizations which may not have as well established of a reporting cadence, where they're not as comfortable with what's being measured. The volume tends to be a little bit lower once they get it right, because they've got to ensure that their audiences are becoming more comfortable with it. And at organizations where there's been more comfort, they might go a little bit higher and have a little bit more bandwidth to just accept numbers that they understand and that are tracking as intended. I mean, for the most part, we tend to manage through exception. The things that are looking right, we say that's great, it's like it should be, let's move on to the next one. And it's the ones that aren't tracking as we'd intended that we start to dig in and say, why does it look that way? What do we have to do differently? And there's just only so much bandwidth to track only so many things. So I said 8's the magic number. It's also a small number. It's a relatively small number. And what it really emphasizes for most organizations is that there's this great need to summarize performance in a meaningful way, because it's really difficult to provide a very granular look at which buyers are doing what or which assets are working really well when we're trying to tell that larger story of how marketing is contributing. And I think that's a nice segue into, well, what are we seeing as the focus? Because as part of a research project I worked on, we began to categorize metrics as describing either value that's created during the buying process or value that's created during the customer's life cycle. And then we took those and said, well, is that value that's being created for your company or value that's being created for the buyer and the customer? And we saw a tremendous emphasis on value for my company during the buying process. And so when you think about things like how much revenue did we produce, or how much pipeline are we running, or sales productivity, those types of things tended to dominate both marketing executive dashboards, but also sales executive dashboards. However, and this is where it gets fascinating, at higher growth companies, we saw a much better distribution or inclusion of metrics that began to extend into value created during the customer's life cycle. So a lot more attention to things like wallet share, retention rate, customer lifetime value. So instead of just being laser focused on the acquisition oriented measures, we saw extension toward those measures that do a better job describing value created throughout the whole relationship. And I thought that was meaningful.
Interesting. I want and firmly believe that CMOs need to have metrics against customers and against prospects, if you will. But I know that they're under pressure to really drive acquisition, and whether you call it net new logos, new opportunities, whatever it is, they have a remit to the organization to do something. And so let's get at that and how we can help them sort of reshape that remit in terms of helping them sort of think about these ROI models that you guys have started to develop.
So I'll agree with you, and I'll say, I think the key is to be appropriately balanced against your objectives. If your business is really well dependent on growing your existing customers, make sure that that's adequately reflected in the ways that you're communicating value back to your stakeholders. The other thing, which I think is a big opportunity, is to begin to include more measures of how your customers and buyers are getting value through their work from you, because that's a driver for how well you are going to do toward your business's objectives. Now, I'm going to make a little bit of a hard pivot here between that and the expression of value, when value for our organizations, when marketing is being well involved, because related to creating that revenue lift that I mentioned, we've got to be able to turn that into a series of numbers. It's not just a matter of saying, oh, we're going to report lift and it's going to be perfect, because there needs to be a tangible plan behind it. And in my view, what that plan requires is a system of measures that work together to show that we're being accountable to the business in a way that can demonstrate that marketing is helping the organization be present and competing for more of the available business out there, that marketing is involving itself in a meaningful way, that meaningful way is producing good outcomes for your business, and it's being done in a way that's economical or at a cost that the business can accept. So I'd start by saying there's a certain volume target that every organization has to hit to reach its revenue number. We've been recommending that organizations monitor the percentage of target demand or the overall number of opportunities within a segment that the business has a chance to compete for. And we'll refer to that as engaged demand, which means we're seeing that somebody from that organization and that opportunity is showing up and engaging with us in some meaningful way. So a target to engage demand rate, because if I track that, I can make the story that says, hey, we're getting the opportunity to compete for more business, and it's continuing to grow, and it's at a level which is suitable to hit our revenue target.
Let's go through that again, because you went through the formula and you mentioned the presence, meaningfulness, productivity, and sort of economic value as those sort of four buckets, right? And so let's go through that again and the formula again, just to make sure, because we're all listening and I want to make sure that we got that.
Right. So the start is the percentage of your target demand that becomes engaged. That's the formula.
Okay. How are we figuring that out? Where's the source for that?
Where's the source for that? So as part of our revenue waterfall process, for each of the segments you go after, we believe there is a market sizing activity that has to happen, which says we could be selling this many units of demand overall over a 3-year period. And we believe that of that, X, it might be 30%, is able to be competed for in any given year. That's a starting point. That is our market size for a 12-month period. And let's say it's 1,000 for argument's sake.
Right.
I may know that to hit my revenue target of those 1,000, I have to have some level of engagement with 20% of those. This is going to be part of my revenue modeling activity, because I'm going to have started with something that says, this is my revenue target. I've got to work backwards from what I've traditionally been able to produce based on conversion rate to say, how many opportunities do I have to compete for this year?
Right. Let's just say we need to close, in your model, there's 1,000 opportunities out there, and we're going to close 30% of our, or 33%. I need 200 to close 70, whatever, 66 of those, right? And that's sort of the way what we're working backwards on, assuming the average deal size of those 66 hits our number. Something like that.
We're going to have done our math, which says we need $10 million. That means so many wins. I've got to back that up all the way through to how many do I have to be competing for? And to compete for business, that means I have to at least have gotten the attention of someone there. It's a waterfall process. It's really been core to our B2B research practice for really a decade.
Okay, what's the next one?
So the next thing that we've been recommending organizations look at is a metric that I'm referring to as sufficient pipeline. Today, organizations may be using something like influenced pipeline, where they're saying, if we can see that there's one interaction with one person associated with one opportunity, we're going to use that to say, this is the portion of the overall pipeline that marketing's had one interaction. If you'll remember from just a few moments ago, I said we have to do a data activity which says how many interactions is right. What is the volume of interactions that's worthwhile for us to create that's going to drive an amount of revenue lift that is meaningful for the business? Once I've nailed down that number, let's say it's 12 for a given segment, I now want to report on the percentage of my active pipeline, which has that characteristic. So if 20% of the opportunities I'm currently running have exceeded that 12 interaction level, because we've already decided that 12 is the level which gets me X% revenue lift, I want to know that in a very active way. I can do that for pipeline that exists right now. Things don't have to close for me to know how much of the pipeline has that characteristic.
Interesting. Okay, so the sufficient pipeline, it's more than just pipeline, it's pipeline that meets a certain criteria, right? And that's different than the way people talk about opportunity, right? This is pipeline that is sort of reaching that as we're using this 12 interaction target, but that's the mythical 12, whatever it is for your business.
Right, okay. that marketing has engaged with at the volume it expected to. Now, this is going to transition to the next metric I care about, because, and I've heard this objection repeatedly, okay, so if we set a number like 12, what's going to stop us from just stuffing 12 like garbage interactions there to make our number? That's where we want to have something that keeps us honest. And this is where we're going to introduce a lift metric. This is a metric that I have to use retroactively on business that has closed already. And we had started by saying, I think for argument's sake, it was 36% lift. 36% lift is what I got out of 12 interactions before. I want to make sure that as more of my opportunities reach that interaction level, that my lift level stays at least that 36%. So I'm getting more opportunities to match those conditions, which are creating better outcomes. That keeps everything on track, because we don't want to see, okay, twice as many opportunities have 12 interactions, but now the lift percentage is half that. It's 18. I've run in place if that's the case. I can't afford for that to happen.
Okay, I think what we've got is we can't stuff the ballot by just saying 12, because we know that there's a certain type of 12 interactions that define the sufficiency of this pipeline. Okay, now we get to marketing lift. How did we get from, okay, these types of interactions, if we do those 12, which will define the pipeline, to marketing lift? And I'm sorry, I've just...
Okay, no, that's okay. So we tried to do this without a worksheet to make this magically come to life, but that's all right. So we've done our exercise. We've arrived at 12 at the number. And 12 is a volume. It's not a type of interactions. It's just it's 12. We've got to do our work to make sure we're coming up with the right mix of 12 to keep 36 as the number. But what we're modeling is we're looking at how our close rate improves over the average when we have 12 interactions, as opposed to whatever might have been average in the segment. So maybe, for example, your average opportunity close rate was 25%. But when it's 12, when you hit your 12 interactions level, maybe it goes up to 35. That's one dimension of the lift.
Okay, so the lift is the difference between the 35 that marketing drove and the 25 that would have happened without it, kind of thing?
That is a portion of it.
Okay.
There's a multiplier here, though.
Almost there. Good.
There's a multiplier here because your close rate has the opportunity to change. The other thing that has the opportunity to change is the deal size. If we're doing our jobs well in the situations which we're involved, and this won't be true in every company. Sometimes the deal size is the deal size. It doesn't matter how much marketing involvement there is. But if part of the strategy is that solution size, selling price is going to increase through better efforts of selling and marketing, we want to factor that in as well. You may see an increase of a few percentage points there again when there are more interactions. So it's a factor of the two. I have a very handy worksheet that calculates this for us to say, we're going to look at deal size, we're going to look at close rate. And the nice part about doing it this way is we're looking at what's typical when marketing gets involved at that level, as opposed to picking one opportunity out of the pile and having a debate over whether marketing helped on this one or not. That, I find, is not the most productive of conversations. The way I like to see this work is we look at what is typical when marketing involvement is good, and then it gives us the opportunity to go back to the pile and say, let's go and pull out one of those good ones, understand what was involved in it, and figure out what it is that we can do to replicate it. Now, that's less of a metrics discussion and more of an analysis discussion, which is, okay, now that we've understood which are good, let's go and deconstruct it, understand its DNA, and make sure that we're making that happen. Understand if it's scalable, what we saw happen in that deal, and if it is, making it scale.
Okay, so we've got target to engage, we've got sufficient pipeline, we've got marketing lift, and I know there's one more sort of key here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Lift isn't free. Like there's an investment that we have to put into our programs to go and create greater engagement with our buyers. We've got to come up with a ratio that compares the dollar value of that lift that we've generated and the dollar value that we've invested in marketing programs in that segment over the same time period. That's what we're trying to understand. What I'm recommending is, as we move forward, we shift that a little bit and take that same program investment, but now compare it to the lift number that we've been able to develop. It might not look as attractive, but our sense is that it is a better view of marketing's contribution back to the organization.
And is the idea with this that it may be the way we are spending our money, or it is, how much we're spending? And because
yeah, that really is the right question, Drew. So at this level, when we're talking about highly summarized measures, and what we're trying to figure out is volume. These are the big trends. How much are we spending versus how much are we getting? Are we affecting enough of the pipeline in the way that we want to or not? Are we filling enough? Are we helping the organization arrive at something which is a full enough pipeline? Those are the questions we're answering at this level. That is in no way meant to say that there should not and cannot and will not be deeper analysis that say, now, show me the mix that's going into that. Am I buying the right things with my dollars? Can I take those same 12 interactions and double my lift if I shift my mix and go more heavily towards social, or increase the amount of reputation-oriented activity in there? Those are all great questions. We're not going to answer that on our CMO dashboard, though.
Okay. All right. And probably makes sense because that's just making the sausage. That's what we're supposed to be doing. I got it. Okay. There have been a lot of questions about technology that supports attribution and, which could support some of the things that you're talking about here. I'm curious if you have thoughts on that, because it was a lot. There were several questions related to that.
So there are a few different categories of tech. So I'm not going to call out vendor names here, but the requirements are we have to be able to connect marketing interactions to people and people to opportunities to be able to make any of this work. Right? There are a slew of marketing attribution technologies for the B2B space, things that might have made their bones through like attribution models like first touch or multi-touch, U-shaped or W-shaped models, all of those tactic-oriented models that allow you to do analysis around which tactics are working and which are not. That's a class of technologies that organizations can use. I've seen other organizations use a combination of lead to account matching technologies and BI tools to go and produce this sort of analysis. I think the important thing here is that we do need an ops team or a marketing analytics team to put in the strokes here to gather the data, to make those connections between interactions, people, and opportunities if we're going to understand those inflection points, those points at which better outcomes are achieved. That's what's truly essential here, using the data that we have to understand where better outcomes occur. I don't know if that was specific enough.
No, that does. So one of the things we really haven't talked about, so we're in the Great Resignation. Employer brand matters more than ever. This comes up all the time. The more we build up a brand, the easier it is for us to recruit. And also when they get the swag box, it gets easier to keep them after they've accepted. So brand seems to play a bigger role in employee engagement, not to mention customer retention. We haven't talked at all about measuring brand in any of these metrics.
When it comes to brand measurement, I've done some work in this area, and there are certainly thoughts that I can share. And the first is, if we're spending significant dollars and resources against it, we've got to figure out a way to go and reflect the fact that we are either making progress against it or that we're not, and we need to change something. So last I saw, organizations over $1 billion were spending roughly a third of their budget on what we would consider brand programs. It's got to be measured. And the challenge that I've seen is that many organizations will measure brand in a way that is entirely retroactive. It's through the rearview mirror. They're relying on annual, maybe biannual brand studies. And one of the things that we've done a fair amount of work with clients around is bringing into the mix more metrics that we can watch as we go. Things that we can use, typical tools that may be within your organization to get the feeling for how your reputation is tracking in an ongoing way, as opposed to saying, okay, we're going to wait for those brand studies and hope for the best, because that's generally not very satisfying. We've waited for the plane to land before we've decided that we had to change course and land somewhere else. But the idea is, one, absolutely measure brand. The volume at which it's elevated to your CMO dashboard, I think that's going to be situational based on your company's focus and investment level in it. But it is a very common thing for me to see on CMO level dashboards.
Okay, I have follow-up. I want to go back to the brand awareness, just make some observations. I happen to address it in my book where we talk about things like, that as your brand improving, your search performance improves. I mean, believe it or not, your paid search improves as your awareness goes up. It just happens almost directly. Site traffic is another one of those sort of surrogate. And there's a number of behaviors that are sort of real time that you can look at and create sort of your own blended kind of brand health tracking. And so I completely agree with you that while I still think having a brand health tracking in place makes sense, because it's good to know if you have 10% awareness, because that's going to be a problem for you. But it's not a real-time indicator. So I love that. One of the things that comes up a lot, and this is particularly true at the beginning of a relationship between a CMO and a CEO, and often a board, and often investors, is this unrealistic expectation that this new CMO can do pixie dust magic and suddenly take the same amount of budget that the former CMO, who, by the way, trained at the same companies that came from this one and was in the same categories, and the CEO is expecting them to do 10x of what was done before with the same exact budget. Help them, please.
Oh, wow. Yeah, there's some principles that I've seen work, but the scenario that you just laid out is daunting. So the places where I've seen the most success is when I've worked with CMOs who feel like they've been really clear about, one, what it is that marketing is attempting to accomplish. So what that strategy is, and how specifically it's tied to what the business's objectives are. So crystal clear in terms of, here's what we're doing, here's how it relates to what the business is trying to accomplish, and here's what I'm expecting the result to look like. If you're not getting buy-in at that level, I think there's a bigger problem that's probably not being addressed through our metrics. We certainly have, as part of our business, we have generalized benchmarks that say, okay, this is the level of return we're expecting to see on this level of spend. We also can say other businesses of your size and growth rate are putting this much money in. So there might need to be a little bit of diagnostics around, okay, what is the best way to get out of what may be a very conflict-filled starting point, but set clear expectations. Make sure that, as well as the people that you're working with, understand how marketing is intending to achieve that, and hold yourself and your teams to what it is that you said you were going to do. Once you call your shot, you can't say, well, you know what, it went in another pocket. I should get credit for that. It tends not to be a credibility builder.
Okay, so we're setting expectations, or trying, we're linking to business things that the CEO figures are value. And what that's going to be is revenue. That's what every CEO, I want more revenue. But we had this conversation, there was this
behind that, right? Where does that come from? What's marketing going to do to make sure that that happens? What is it going to look like when we're successful there? So I have a lot of conversations that start, well, we're all here to make revenue. You're right. We're all here for revenue, but let's break it down and be really specific about where it's going to happen, how marketing is going to help make that happen, what it's going to cost, and how we're going to know we were good at it.
You were living in a rational world, and I love that. And so one last thought, and then we'll wrap up. But one of the things that is really hard is that you do things that aren't measurable. You can't measure every little thing, or it shows up later, or it shows up in a weird way, and you have sort of anecdotal evidence. This is the classic thing is the B2B brand that runs didn't run any awareness advertising. The CEO goes into a hotel, their company name isn't recognized. They do some marketing, and then the CEO gets his name recognized. Like, oh man, this is great. Somebody called me and said it worked. There's these things that you can't measure. And if we focus only on the things that we can measure, we're only going to be focused on demand gen, and we're never going to think about brand. So I don't know, this is your big summary now.
So let's break it down, because the things we're always going to be able to measure are business impact. So those things at the end of the day that say whether our business did well or not, there are going to be things that sit at the level of revenue, profitability, market share, things that everyone's CEO and boards are going to say, this is what we're out there for. Always measurable, probably not a whole lot of daylight there. What comes next, though, is our strategies for making it happen. And where some of these strategies are not going to have direct linkage, you bring brand up as the example. I like to see an assessment made around how much investment are we putting into it, and has it risen to a level where I need an indicator that tells me it's headed in the right direction. I don't need an ironclad tactic level ROI that says that was the right ad to do, and I'm going to do it again because that one worked. But I do need a way to say, you know what? We did make the CEO happy, and more people I meet at a hotel now know the name of our business. But I'd want to do that in ways that are not only anecdotal. I would want to make sure that that sort of name recall was a little bit more common outside of, okay, I shook the hand of the person who knew us. And I think that is possible. The question we always have to ask is it important enough for us to instrument it and to put our own operational resource against chasing it down? If the investment level is small, probably not. Move on, chalk it up.
Let it go. We can't better. All right. I'm going to wrap this up. Ross Graber, thank you so much for incredible insights. You all heard it. MQL is dead. Start with your target and audience and the overall market, work your way backwards, set some metrics and get agreement internally on those. Ross Graber, thank you so much. Thank you all for attending, and peace out. Renegade Marketers Unite is written and directed by Drew Neiser. Hey, that's me. Audio production is by Sam Beck. Show notes are written by Melissa Caffrey. The music is by the amazing Burns Twins, and intro voiceover is Linda Cornelius. To find the transcripts of all episodes, suggest future guests, or learn more about my new book and the savviest B2B marketing boutique in New York City, visit renegade.com. I'm your host, Drew Neiser, and until next time, keep those renegade thinking caps on and strong.